Hello, everyone. We're on the air. Today, we're going to discuss the issue of rhetoric, the free citizen, and humanism. I'm Dr. Alexander Rosenthal, the director and co-founder of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with, as usual, Dr. Miles Smit. Would you like to introduce yourself again?
Hello, everybody. We're pleased to be back with you, whether you're watching live or whether you're viewing this afterwards. Today, we wanted to broach a topic that's of interest to a lot of people, certainly relevant, and that is rhetoric. You may know us from our course on the virtues. So for a lot of the audience, people would be asking, well, if I'm interested in something like the virtues, why would I be interested in something like rhetoric? Isn't that about deception? So Alex, out there are a lot of perhaps pejorative senses of what rhetoric means. Did you want to give people a kind of fresh start and give a kind of succinct sense of what rhetoric meant in the Greco-Roman context?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, one of the things that we'll discuss is that rhetoric came under attack even within the classical world. But I think just in common speech, if you say that is mere rhetoric or that is rhetorical or you're being rhetorical, or certainly if you say that is sophistry, these are all pejorative concepts. And, that sense of rhetoric as pejorative also itself has a history. But in its original meaning, it had a quite noble sense of essentially being, we could say, public speech with a view to persuasion. And this was very important in the Greek and Roman worlds. So.
Well, that's an interesting starting point. So quite far from the pejorative sense of sophistry or being merely rhetorical or perhaps aiming to use words to subvert reason, there is a sense, or there was a sense in the classical setting that rhetoric is an important tool and enabler to the free citizen. Is that a good starting point?
Absolutely. Last time when I was discussing ancient and modern political philosophy with Ted, I referenced the funeral oration of Pericles, right? And what Pericles says there is that we alone among nations regard the man who takes no thought for public affairs not as a harmless man, but as a useless man. So I think we have to think about rhetoric in the context of the growth of this idea of the free citizen. When the Greeks looked out on say the ancient great civilizations of the Middle East, they saw divine right monarchies, right? The rulers sharply distinguished from the ruled. The rulers made the laws, and the lot of everyone else was to obey the laws made by the rulers, right? The Greeks introduced this idea of autonomy, right? And what autonomy meant was that those who are bound by the laws are also those who make the laws, right? So you have an active citizenry, and this is something that develops in the growth of democracy in Athens and elsewhere in the 6th century and the 5th centuries BC, an active citizenry which participates both in legal and in political deliberative affairs, right? And so if you think about it, the despot really doesn't have to persuade anyone, right? Or the divine right king doesn't really have to persuade anyone. But if you want to be successful in this new democratic context, you need to be able to speak with skill. And so really, rhetoric is about the skills necessary to succeed in a society based on free citizenry. And so maybe should I talk a little bit about the sophists and the rise of the rhetorical tradition?
Well, yeah, I think that's really timely because what a lot of us will have just heard was something very relevant in terms of rhetoric and our society as a kind of litmus test. The idea that where there is healthy rhetoric, there is likely to be healthy civic fabric, and where rhetoric is degraded, it may be a sign of limited public virtue, a sign of limited public liberty. And so, on the one hand, although there might be the flatterers, the deceivers, some of the most effective, inspiring, and learned leaders that we've had have also been some of the great speech givers. So you mentioned Pericles. Other people might now be thinking about Abe Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. and
Sure.
Churchill, his most stirring addresses. And those things, arise out of not just a deep command of language and the cunning of reason, but deep historical rooting, the perspective of a grand strategist or a global leader, someone able to inspire through humane virtues, through erudition, through biblical and Shakespearean grounding, things like that. So, did you want to unpack that theme, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll sort of start at the beginnings with the sophists, who of course have had a bad name for reasons that we'll partially discuss. Right? They come under critique by Plato. But all the historians and classicists that I have read talk also about the sophists as the origins of our Western paideia, of the Western educational tradition. So, so I think what we can think about in terms of the radical revolution that's going on is that before the rise of these democracies and the free citizen polis, right? The idea in Greece as elsewhere was that rulership was a kind of gift of the gods, arete, the excellence or skill which enables one to be a great ruler was simply a gift given to certain families, right? Within a caste system. What the sophists introduced is the idea that arete, the political skills necessary to succeed in the self-governed society, is something which can be taught, right? And obviously, if persuasion is the way to go forward and succeed, you're going to need teachers. And this is basically what the sophists were about. Now, we could think of them as, quote-unquote, merely teachers of rhetoric, but you have to think about the basic idea that they had was the power of words. Here was a little quotation from Gorgias, one of the early sophists. He wrote, "Speech is a powerful lord which by means of the finest and most invisible body affects the divinest works. It can stop fear and banish grief and create joy and nurture pity," right? So it's about the power of words, which means you have to study words and information in many different contexts. You have to study grammar, right, basically. You study poetry to understand the beauty of language and its emotional power, right? As well as history to understand things about human nature, right? And you have to, many of the sophists even talked about, mathematics and the natural sciences, right? I mean, rhetoric is a very broad idea because one can speak on any topic effectively, right? So it really forms the framework, and the sophists are basically itinerant teachers who are going from city to city, earning their livelihood, training citizens in statesmanship, because effectively the statesman is the rhetor in ancient Greece. This educational tradition passes on to Rome, which, Rome had a res publica. They thought of government as the public thing, and so speech, while the Romans never fully took to philosophy in quite the same way as the Greeks, they very much took to rhetoric, right? And in fact, you have the schools of rhetoric, and so, Augustine, for example, was a trained rhetor. That was his profession before he became a Christian, eventually bishop, right? And so you have this, educational tradition that was really grounding things, and the study of rhetoric. I mean, it got a kind of new lease on life as a practical art during the Renaissance, where you had free cities rising, and it became really part of the Western educational system. Down to the 20th century, if you think of someone like you mentioned, Winston Churchill would have spent his childhood reading, copying, translating, Latin orators and so forth. So it's been an enormously important and powerful tradition. But maybe I should talk a little bit about the conflict of philosophy and rhetoric to define paideia, just so that we understand, well, why has it acquired this this negative meaning a little bit.
I think that's right now. I mean, people are in some ways in a world still aware of these kind of towering figures, the Churchills and whatnot. But on the other hand, they also live in a world of madmen, of advertising agencies of the manipulation of images and emotions, so that the entire direction of persuasion seems to be away from the kind of civic virtue, the kind of liberal virtue you talk about, and certainly from the works of reason and philosophy.
Yes. So, I mean, the key figure there, of course, would be Plato, and Socrates, of course, didn't write anything in his own hand, but clearly the figure of Socrates. So, the basic issue comes to something like this. If I am an itinerant teacher, and I want, say, for the sake of argument, I want to teach people how to be successful in Sparta, that might be something quite different than being successful in Athens, right? What is required for success requires knowing the customs of each place. And then the question becomes, well, am I interested in truth or am I interested in success, right? Because, of course, the whole bias of the educational system, right, was how to be successful. And, I mean, you could think about, if I'm talking about a political opponent, am I aiming to say the precise truth about that opponent, right? Or am I aiming to say to discredit the opponent so that I can be successful, right? And so the concern, I think, was really about the subordination of truth and virtue to this practical political goal of sort of gaining power, right? So I think that this is really what becomes the pejorative, right? Because the sophists are so skilled at what they do. Well, there's the definition of sophistry that's sometimes given as making the weaker argument appear the stronger. You know, it's something that sometimes lawyers, for example, are thought of in this way, that they can argue any side and achieve any result as long as you pay them. You know, this is the negative view that lawyers, sometimes put on lawyers. So it's really this sort of thing, and really Plato is trying to reorient the whole system of paideia. This is really what the Republic is about, toward a vision of truth rather than a vision of arete, excellence, as being about political success merely, right? So it's a moral critique of rhetoric. And we could say that rhetoric and philosophy are sort of jockeying. Now, I should say that the rhetors hit back. So Socrates, who wants to defend rhetoric, he is really, as far as I know, he's the first stable teacher of rhetoric who established a set school. You know, rather than wandering around the Greek city-states, right? He establishes a set school, and it becomes, in some ways, you could say, kind of a rival of Plato's Academy. And his argument is basically that rhetoric can be used in all these bad ways, but it doesn't have to be, right? Rhetoric has this great power, but it can be a tool of civic-mindedness, right? It can be a tool of virtue, and he sees, he writes a speech against the sophists, separating the proper teaching of rhetoric from sophistry in the negative sense, and talks about rhetoric as a training. There's a training in character, and actually in his speech, Panegyricus, he really thinks that paideia is what unites the Greeks, right? It's not Greek blood, he says explicitly. It's not Greek blood, it's Greek paideia, which really unites us. And so this is really sort of the response, we could say. And one final great rhetor that I should mention is Demosthenes, right? Who's probably the last great rhetor of the classical epoch. And he clearly, rhetoric has always been connected with this idea of the free citizenry, and Demosthenes is trying to direct the Greeks, telling them, and the Athenians particularly, that their freedoms are in jeopardy by the Macedonians, right? He writes the famous Philippics, right? And he talks about the importance of freedom of speech, parrhesia, right? Right, and how the freedoms of the Greeks are in jeopardy, and he's really sort of the twilight of the Greek polis, right? Because, of course, Philip and his son Alexander do in the end conquer, and this is really puts kind of a period on the classical era of Greece, right, with the fall of the polis. So that would be sort of my little overview of Greek rhetoric in the classical epoch.
Well, that's quite a great package, Alex. So I think with that, the entire audience is now convinced that rhetoric touches their lives for good or for ill. So, if we had persuaded them of the merits of hot rodding, they would want to know, where do I get the kit? Where do I get the carburetor and the gear shift and the chassis?
Yeah, well, obviously we have rhetoric today. We just call it by different names, right? What are speech writers, public relations officials, spinning things the right way, right? I mean, so it retains both the same, both, I think, pejorative as well as positive connotations that it would have had in ancient Greece, and so probably that's really part of that inheritance.
Absolutely. So if people want to understand rhetoric a bit better, to defend their civic virtue, they want to be like Paul Simon and write simple desultory philippics, what are the elements that they need to know about, right? What are the components as seen by the classics, and to understand the whole package of rhetoric? Well,
I mean, I think the really great figure in this, the two great figures would be Aristotle and Cicero. Aristotle, takes up the topic of rhetoric. He writes a famous work about it, Rhetoric. Maybe, perhaps not the most imaginative title, but there it is. And so he basically, takes the view, obviously, that philosophy and rhetoric need not be enemies, right? This is much milder view than what comes through in some of the works of Plato. And so he talks about three central elements to persuasion. Okay, so there is ethos, meaning particularly the character of the speaker. Meaning, if you're not credible, right? If I walk into a room and it's already known that I've been convicted of fraud 30 times, my credibility would suffer if I begin trying to sell you something, right? So ethos means you have to demonstrate your credibility as a speaker, right? Then is pathos, which is basically emotion. And Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about human nature and how human beings are affected emotionally by things. I think one of the most brilliant examples of pathos would be, in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. Remember, Shakespeare would have also been thoroughly immersed in the rhetorical tradition. But you see that Brutus gives us rather rational but rather dull speech, and then Antony is going on about all the things that Caesar did for them, and and now he's with 20 stab wounds through him and all this stuff. Look at the blood, you know what I mean? So he knows how to arouse the crowd using the passions. And the last, of course, is logos, which is the aspect of rational argumentation. And this is true. I mean, Aristotle formalizes logic, but even the sophists talk about dialectic, which is simply the art of argumentation, how to make a reasoned argument. And I should also say that Aristotle also provides a division of the different kinds of rhetoric, which I think is very helpful, right? So we already talked about, so the two ways in which the citizen would be very involved in Greece would be in judicial issues, in court, right? Either defending or attacking, or as a juror, right? So there was an active citizenry. So legal speeches where the issue is guilt or innocence. Then you have deliberative speeches, right? Every Athenian freeborn male citizen would meet in the assembly and deliberate over whatever policy issues, right? What ought we to do is really the issue of deliberative rhetoric. And then there's epidectic rhetoric, which is, actually, I gave you an example of it with the line from Gorgias. That was written to Helen. It's really just a demonstration of rhetorical skill, praising or blaming someone. And this was a common motif, Helen of Troy, for whatever reason. This was a common exercise for demonstrating your your rhetorical skill was in the notion of praise or blame. I suppose we have the idea of the eulogy, right, today, which is quite similar. So, well, that covers Aristotle. Do I have a couple of minutes to talk about Cicero, or?
I think people want to hear about it.
Sure. So, I mean, so the Roman figure, like I said, the Romans really took to rhetoric like a fish to water. You know, philosophy, it never acquired the status in Rome that it did in Greece. But rhetoric went very naturally with their idea of republican government, right? They abhorred kings and thought of government, even though it wasn't precisely a democracy because different social classes were weighted differently. It was very much a republic, and one also succeeded in terms of public life. And Cicero devotes a great amount of time to the study of rhetoric. He's often thought of as the figure who establishes the canons of rhetoric. And so, like, every speech was supposed to have the elements of inventio, which would mean finding the proper arguments, right? What is the argument you wish to make, right? Dispositio, how the speech is going to be arranged, right? Illocutio, what is the style of the speech, right? A speech that you give to the Oxford Debating Society might be different than a speech that you would give to the stockholders of, you know, a Rotary Club or whatever it is, right? You have to know the audience and adjust the style. And they spent a lot of time talking about style and figures and so forth. Then memoria, right? The speaker had to memorize a whole lot, have a whole lot of information on their fingertips, and mnemonics was very important in the rhetorical tradition. And the last thing, but perhaps the most important, was actia, the actual delivery of the speech, which involved things like the volume of voice, right, the rising and fall of the voice, right, and gestures and these sorts of things, right. Each of these things was studied in painstaking detail. So if you want to know why rhetoric in general may have declined, you know, in the last, in recent decades, I mean, the loss of the rhetorical tradition may be part of that. So.
Well, there you go. Ethos, logos, pathos, a whole bunch of Latin words and a better understanding of Orwell. I think for a first pass, we've given the topic a good whooping.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I should say is we've talked about offering rhetoric courses. So if anybody is interested in that, you know, please let me know. Either leave a comment on the YouTube video, or you can just email me at alex.rosenthal@petrarch-institute.com. You can find my email and so forth on the website, which is now linked, www.petrarch-institute.com, if you want to go for it. And we're also having this course in October on classical philosophy and the virtues. So if you're interested, please let me know.
You can also find us on Twitter at Petrarch Center, where center is spelt the Commonwealth way, in tribute to the ongoing Commonwealth Games, C-E-N-T-R-E, Petrarch Center at Twitter. So we're happy to meet you on any of those fora.
Okay, well, I guess that sort of wraps it up. No, Miles?
See you guys all soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.